Dwi eisiau nodi ychydig o bwyntiau. Cynelir y cyfarfod hwn ar ffurf hybrid gyda rhai aelodau yn y siambr, y Senedd ac eraill yn ymuno drwy gyswllt fideo. Mae cyfarfod llawn y gynelir drwy gynadledd fideo yn unol ar rheolau sefydlog Senedd Cymru'n gyfystyr y thrafodion y Senedd a dibenion deddf Llywodraeth Cymru 2006. Bydd rhai o ddarpariaethau rheol sefydlog 34 yn gymwys ar gyfer y cyfarfod llawn heddi a mae'r rhain wedi nodi ar yr agenda. A dwi hefyd eisiau atgoffa'r aelodau fod y rheolau sefydlog sy'n ymwneud â threfn yn y cyfarfod llawn yn berthnasol i'r cyfarfod yma ac yr un mor berthnasol i'r aelodau sydd yn y siambr a'r rhai sy'n ymuno drwy gyswllt fideo. Yr eitem gyntaf felly ar yn agenda'r prynawn yma yw'r cwestiynau'r Prif Weinidog ac mae'r cwestiwn cyntaf gan Lyn Eagle.
Thank you, Llywydd. What steps is the First Minister taking to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on young people in Wales?
Llywydd, action has been taken across the Welsh Government to mitigate the impact of coronavirus on young people. New investments in training, apprenticeships, further and higher education and mental health services are amongst the responses mobilised to address the challenges young people face.
First Minister, thank you for that. We know that the pandemic has had a huge impact on children and young people, and I very much welcome the commitment in the COVID reconstruction plan you published today that you will make sure that our young people do not lose out educationally or economically, and that you will support all of our young people to stay in education. Many young people who travel from Torfaen to Hereford College for their post-16 education are being prevented by Transport for Wales from boarding trains despite holding season tickets to travel, and are instead being made to travel on buses without social distancing, while other passengers are being prioritised for socially distant train seats. Some young people have been left stranded or are arriving at college late. Do you share my concern, First Minister, that young people are being treated differently to other passengers? And what steps will the Welsh Government take to ensure that young people are not disadvantaged on public transport?
Well, of course, I agree with Lyn Eagle that young people should not be disadvantaged for the sake of being young people. But I do know that it is the case that there are trains that can appear to have spaces on them, but those spaces are necessary in order to comply with the regulations that have to be observed by Transport for Wales on both sides of the border. Transport for Wales is providing 70 different bus services to help those young people who otherwise would be unable to go to college or to school in the normal way. An additional carriage has been added to a train arriving in Hereford at 8:53 in the morning since last week in order to assist some of the young people that Lyn Eagle has referred to. But travelling by bus, while it is often not as convenient as a train journey, for young people who are cohorting and who are together in a bubble for education purposes, it can be a way that allows those young people to travel safely together. So we continue to work on the issue. While I absolutely agree that young people should not be treated differently for the sake of being young people, Transport for Wales, in very challenging circumstances, are working hard to make sure that Lyn Eagle's constituents and young people in all parts of Wales have the transport they need to be able to access their education.
Angela Burns.
Thank you, Llywydd. First Minister, a report by Barnados earlier this year highlighted the crisis that's facing fostering, with a 45% rise in children needing foster care within Wales, and yet conversely a 51% drop in the availability of foster carers because of the pandemic. And obviously we can all appreciate the issues that this has thrown up for being able to find foster carers for young people desperately in need of them. Can you please outline what the Welsh Government is able to do to help to bring more parity back on this situation, to increase the number of foster carers we have so that these children are able to get the support within a family environment that they so desperately need?
So I thank Angela Burns for that. I think earlier in the summer when the Barnardo's report was published. We were able to correct some of the misreporting of those figures because those figures do not reflect the position of foster care in Wales, where we've actually had quite a healthy recruitment of foster carers during the pandemic, and where we have been able to go on making foster care places available to those young people who need them. Now it is, as Angela Burns will know, a constant effort to make sure that we are recruiting the people we need to offer foster care, sometimes to young people who've got some significant issues in their lives. Sometimes those are physical disabilities, sometimes they are the legacy of their own histories. And we will go on to create a national fostering network here in Wales to make sure that opportunities for people who wish to become foster carers and young people who need foster caring do not end at the boundaries of their own local authorities, mirroring some of the success we have had in the National Adoption Service. So the position in Wales is not quite as the reporting of the Barnardo's report might have led some people to believe. It's been reasonably sustained in this very difficult period, but there's always more we want to do.
Yw'r.
Diolch, Llywydd. Mae'n mater o gonsern difrifol I fi yr effaith mae'r pandemig a'r cyfyngiadau yn ei gael ar lesiant pobl ifanc a phobl o bob oed o ran hynny. Dwi'n clywed tystiolaeth anecdotaidd gan bobl yn y maes meddygol a meysydd cysylltiedig am gynnydd yn nifer hunanladdiadau a phobl yn niweidio I hunain. A wneith y Llywodraeth fel mater o frys gasglu a chyhoeddi data, ar hynny fel bod ni'n gwybod beth sy'n mynd ymlaen, a llunio strategaeth ar sut I ddelio efo problemau llesiant, a rhoi eglurhad clir hefyd o sut maen nhw'n cydbwyso yr angen I ddelio efo Covid, efo'r angen I sicrhau llesiant pobl wrth ystyried pa gyfyngiadau i'w cyflwyno a'i codi ag yn y blaen.
Wel, diolch yn fawr, Llywydd. Wrth gwrs, mae y dau beth yn mynd dy gilydd. Ni yn gwybod y cyfnod o'r coronavirus wedi bod yn cyfnod anodd dros ben I nifer fawr o bobl ifanc yma yng Nghymru. Dyna pam ni wedi cryfhau y gwasanaethau sydd 'da ni I helpu bobl ifanc, fwy o arian i'r addysg uwch, fwy o arian I addysg bellach, I cefnogi lleisiant bobl ifanc pan maen nhw'n astudio, fwy o arian i'r ysgolion ni, I roi fwy o bobl I helpu yn y gwasanaethau sydd 'da ni yn barod, a fwy o help trwy meic hefyd. Dwi'n siŵr bydd Rhina Bioreth yn wybodol am meic, sef llinell ar y teleffon ble mae bobl ifanc yn gallu siarad gyda rhywun. Trwy'r dydd, lan at hanner nos hefyd, ni wedi rhoi fwy o arian i'r meic I bod yn glir bydd y gwasanaeth yna ar gael trwy'r flwyddyn ariannol presennol. Ni yn casglu'r data, wrth gwrs, yn y rhaglenni ni'n redig yn Ian ac ni yn cyhoeddi data hefyd. Os mae rhywbeth penodol mae'r Rhina Bioreth yn eisiau weld, wrth gwrs dwi'n ffallol hapus I trafod hwnna 'da fe ac I roi y wybodaeth iddo fe os mae hwnna'n ar gael.
Tynwyd cwestiwn 2 yn ôl, ac felly cwestiwn 3, Caroline Jones.
Diolch, Llywydd. What plans does the Welsh Government have to increase the penalties for those breaking COVID-19 rules?
Llywydd, we keep all aspects of our regulations under continual review, including our approach to fixed penalty notices. We are currently considering whether the regime needs to be adapted to address specific issues such as the holding of house parties.
Thank you, First Minister. It is blatantly obvious that the carrot approach is not working, and the fines imposed aren't much of a deterrent either. Most of the population of South Wales are once again in draconian lockdowns, and all because of the actions of a selfish minority. We have had our liberty curtailed because a few people wanted to have house parties. We are not allowed to visit loved ones because some people thought the rules did not apply to them, or that 60 quid was a small price to pay for a bit of fun. Rules apply to everyone, from government ministers to governance students, and it is high time we crack down on rule breakers. And I'm fed up of seeing social media littered with people flagrantly and unashamedly breaking the rules. First Minister, do you agree that we need far steeper penalties and stricter enforcement if we are to avoid more local or even national lockdowns? Diolch.
Diolch, Llywydd. Well, I agree with aspects of the member's supplementary question. I agree with her that the vast majority of people in Wales continue to observe the rules and to be scrupulous about it, and the breaches of the rules are carried out by a small minority of people when those breaches are deliberate, flagrant, and repeated. When I spoke with the Chief Constable of Gwent last week about the position in Gwent, where local restrictions have been in place for a number of weeks, she told me that 95% of the population there were complying with the rules and working hard to do so. So I don't agree with some of the things the member said, which seem to imply that there was wholesale non-observation of the restrictions that we've had to put in place. Where there is a need to increase penalties, we have done so. Back in May, we added to the multiplier of people who repeatedly break the rules, so that the maximum penalty in Wales went from £120 to £1,920. And we moved quickly in advance of August bank holiday to make sure that £10,000 fines were available in Wales for people who seek to organise illegal music events. Now, we continue to discuss with the police whether they would find it useful to have extended penalties, as I say, in a number of specific areas, including people who organise house parties and people who flagrantly refuse to observe self-isolation. And if the case is there, then we will do it. In the end, I just make this final point to the member, Llywydd. This only works in the end if we have a trust-based system. If people are willing to play their part and are convinced of the need to do so. Enforcement has to be a last resort, not a first resort, but where that last resort is needed, we won't hesitate to use it in Wales.
Mark Isherwood.
I live in the largest population crossing a national boundary in the UK, with close relatives nearby on both sides of our invisible border. In this context, what penalties for breaking COVID-19 rules do you believe should apply where an anaesthetic junior doctor at Ysbyty Glan Clwyd to meet his fiancée undertaking a clinical fellowship at Christie Hospital in Manchester, which each has to live locally to these hospitals? Each has been at the front line of the coronavirus pandemic since its beginning here, which led both to contract COVID-19 in the course of their work. Each has worked additional hours without additional pay. Each lives alone. They persevered with physical and mental exhaustion by supporting each other. However, your latest announcement on lockdown restrictions in North East Wales means that their primary outlet of support is now illegal because they can't visit each other.
Well, I've no doubt, Llywydd, that they will understand better than the member why those restrictions are necessary. On the Welsh side of the North East Wales border, the rates of coronavirus are still below 100 per 100,000 in the population. In Manchester today, they are reporting over 500 per 100,000 of the population. And people who work in the health service will undoubtedly understand why it is not sensible for people from very high coronavirus areas to be able to travel to and mix with people who live in areas where the virus is not in such vivid circulation. Those members of the health service will also know, even if the member doesn't, that the impact of coronavirus at community level is now being felt in our hospitals as well. In the last week, we have 453 beds in our NHS occupied by people with suspected or confirmed coronavirus. 2 weeks ago, that was 203. Now, if the member does not understand the need to take action and to take action now to prevent the impact on our NHS returning to where it once was earlier in the year, then I can assure him that people who work from the health service understand that very well.
Cwestiynau nawr gan arweinwyr y pleidiau, Arweinydd Plaid Cymru, Adam Price.
Diolch, Llywydd. On Monday, First Minister, it was reported that there were 596 new positive COVID cases identified in Wales following a lab test, the highest figure, I believe, since the pandemic began. And SAGE has said that cases overall in Wales are likely to be increasing on a daily basis by between 1% and 5% a day. Over the past fortnight, I've raised with you the absurdity of people in lockdown areas of England being able to travel to Wales, to areas where community transmission is low. The UK Prime Minister's dismissal of the prospect of such travel restrictions should not have come as much of a surprise, perhaps given the general contempt with which his government repeatedly demonstrates towards Wales. We've called for action consistently on this issue since the summer. Can you say whether and when you intend to take action yourselves independently as a government? And in addition to looking at introducing quarantine as a solution, is consideration being given to making non-essential travel into Wales from a lockdown area illegal and subject to enforcement by the police?
Well, so I thank Adam Price for that. I share his sense of disappointment at the Prime Minister's apparent conclusion. I say apparent because although he gave an interview which he opined on this matter, he is yet to reply to my letter to him of Monday last week. And I think that is deeply disrespectful, not to me, but to the Senedd and to people here in Wales. I do expect to see a reply to that letter, and I expect to see a rationale set out in that letter that explains why the Prime Minister appears to have come to his conclusion. What I asked for in my letter was not a border solution. It was a solution that would have prevented people living in hotspot areas in England from travelling to other places where the virus was not in the same place, whether that was in England or Scotland or in Wales. That's the solution that we have in Wales. People who live in high coronavirus areas in Wales aren't able to travel to England to take the virus with them. And I still think that that is the right answer, and I pressed that again with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in a meeting held with him yesterday. In the meantime, Llywydd, we have to prepare against the day when the Prime Minister continues to refuse to take this straightforwardly sensible course of action. And there are a range of ways in which we could act. Quarantine is one of them. Members will remember the 5-mile rule we had in Wales, or the 5-mile guidance at least we had in Wales earlier in the summer, and the possibility that Adam Price has set out is another possibility that we could use within our own powers. I think that is the second best way to do it. I've put the best way to the Prime Minister. I expect to get a proper answer from him. If he refuses to do that, then of course we will think about what we can do and are actively exploring what we can do with the powers we hold ourselves.
The Scottish Government, First Minister, has confirmed that it will be imposing far tighter restrictions in the coming days. You yourself have received advice from the Technical Advisory Cell saying that the earlier additional measures are introduced, the more effective they will be. The kind of additional measures that we could be talking about in our context could be, for example, closing pubs indoors completely in areas of high infection, as Paris has done for 2 weeks starting from today, backed, of course, by suitable and sufficient industry support packages. What active consideration are you giving to the possibility of introducing a brief period of tighter restriction, a so-called circuit breaker, as it's become known?
Well, Llywydd, of course, we do give consideration to that, and I had an opportunity to discuss that too yesterday with the First Minister of Scotland. Llywydd, we are discussing two sets of measures. The figures that I have seen, the most recent ones, which are probably in the public domain later in the day, show that the local measures we have taken in parts of South Wales are having some success. So I am working with officials to see whether it may be possible, provided that success is sustained, to be able to lift some of the restrictions that we have placed on people in that part of Wales, provided the measures we are taking so far demonstrate an ability to do so. At the same time, we have to prepare, in the way that Adam Price has suggested, for the fact that things could get worse, not better, over this winter. There are a series of measures set out in the plan we published in August for health protection area restrictions. We have not used them all by any means. And if we did need to draw on them further, then we would have to do so. Whether we would have to do so for a brief period of time, I think is, in my view, slightly optimistic. What we're learning from the measures we've already put in place is that it does take a matter of weeks for those to be able to turn the tide of coronavirus around. But we work on both possibilities, both being able to lift restrictions where the data demonstrates it is safe to do so, and on further measures we may have to take if that turns out not to be the case.
I agree with the First Minister that a short-term set of policies is no subsidy really for a long-term strategy. But the Technical Advisory Cell's report, which has just been published actually within the hour, is very sobering reading. I mean, the R rate that it quotes now for Wales is between 1.3 and 1.6, and that contrasts with early September when it was said to be between 0.5 and 1. It says the incidence in Wales now is growing, the infection incidence is growing overall. It goes on to say, unless measures bring R back below 1, it is possible that infection incidence and hospital admissions may exceed scenario planning. And it's previously said that if the current measures don't bring R below 1, then further restrictions will be needed to control the epidemic in Wales. At what point do you think we are now? I mean, are we going the right direction or the wrong direction, First Minister? And would you accept as a general point that every government facing a second wave is having to choose between going early and hard in tightening restrictions or later and lighter and probably longer because those measures will be less effective? There are no risk-free options, in a sense, to any government, but isn't the greatest risk of all dither and delay?
Well, so it's, thank Adam Price, other than his final part of his sentence, because up until then he was making a very important contribution to this discussion. I think the Welsh Government's approach has been early and hard. So our thresholds for action are lower than across our border. Our threshold is 50 cases per 100,000 before we take action. It is 75 across our border. Our positivity rate thresholds are lower than they are in the United Kingdom. And he will be aware that the Welsh Government was very much criticised last week by Conservative members of Parliament, and I think disgracefully Conservative members of the Senedd, when we took action in North Wales, because we hadn't yet reached those 50 thresholds, although it was absolutely obvious to anybody who studied the figures that North Wales was on its way to that threshold, and sadly today is well past it. So we have taken early action, and action which is hard for people. I really do understand that people faced with these local restrictions are being asked to make a contribution that bites into their daily lives. But we've done that because we think, as I think Adam Price said, that if you take action early, then those actions are likely to have to last for a shorter period of time before we can restore freedoms to people. The early indications from South Wales are that we're having some success in doing just that. And while the TAC report is very sobering in what it says, and ought to be a real warning to anybody who thinks that somehow the Welsh Government is acting precipitately or imposing restrictions where they are not needed. That TAC report would surely be important for them to read. But balanced, and it's there in the TAC report as well, is the evidence that the actions we are taking are making a difference. And that is, as Adam Price said, the very difficult balancing act that faces any government attempting to respond proportionately but seriously to the latest flare-up in figures.
Arweinydd y Ceidwadwyr Cymreig, Paul Davies.
Diolch, Llywydd. First Minister, it's been reported today that the list of people waiting for routine surgery in Wales is nearly 6 times longer than a year ago, and one orthopaedic surgeon has warned waiting times for things like knee and hip replacements could be 3 years. Is he right, First Minister?
Well, the member is right to point to the fact that coronavirus is having and has had a very serious impact on the ability of the health service to carry out activities that in any other time would have been central to the work of the National Health Service. That, I'm afraid, is inevitable. It's inescapable. And while the health service is working very hard to create the conditions in which as much activity as possible can be safely carried out while the coronavirus crisis continues, there's no escaping the fact that there will be longer waits for some procedures in Wales than we have seen for some time.
Well, quite clearly, First Minister, the Welsh Government therefore needs to redouble its efforts, because a number of professional organisations have expressed real concern about the resumption of services over the last few months. Over the summer, the Royal College of Surgeons warned that delays to surgery will already have resulted in an increased need for complex surgery. The British Heart Foundation warned that as services remain unavailable, the urgency of these procedures is increasing, creating a significant cohort of patients who need urgent treatment. And BMA Cymru have said that they are concerned at the prospect of managing routine care alongside a second peak. First Minister, these delays will continue to stretch the capacity of the NHS, and these organisations have been warning about this for some time. Now, the Royal College of Surgeons has called on the Welsh Government to ramp up the development of so-called green zones or COVID-light areas in hospitals. Therefore, can you tell us what action the Welsh Government took in response to these warnings to help expedite treatment for those people waiting across Wales? And can you also tell us what work the Welsh Government is doing to accelerate the development of green zones in Welsh hospitals?
Well, Llywydd, the member would find the answer to his questions in the quarterly plans which the NHS in Wales is required to publish. Plans for quarter 3 and 4 were published only recently. They demonstrate the actions that are being taken by health boards right across Wales to accelerate a return to the sort of activity that the health service would have been carrying out this time last year before the coronavirus crisis hit. And that does include the creation of more green zones. It's not always possible in Wales to create whole hospitals as green zones. It's inevitable, given our geography and disposition of services, that in some places hospitals will have to be divided into zones which deal with coronavirus patients and green zones which are COVID-free. But that work is going on, and our colleagues in the health service, who have had such a torrid time over the last 6 months, are working as hard as they can in order to be able both to deal with the rising number of coronavirus patients who are coming into our hospitals. I quoted that figure earlier to Mark Isherwood, over 200 more beds occupied by coronavirus cases today than 2 weeks ago. The health service is having to cope with all of that, and it is at the same time and with the same staff doing its very best to make inroads into the delays that have inevitably occurred in more routine treatments for other patients.
First Minister, I can't emphasise enough that behind the Welsh Government's figures are real people desperately waiting for treatments and surgeries, and even in areas that are not in lockdown measures, like Pembrokeshire, there are examples of extortionately long waits for treatment. For example, last week I highlighted an 81-week wait for dental treatment for an 11-year-old autistic child in my constituency. I've also been contacted by a couple desperate to resume their fertility treatments and waiting for news of when their family planning journey can resume. And people right across Wales, from north to south, are still waiting for treatments and surgeries on a range of matters. Those people need your help, First Minister, and the Welsh Government must now come forward with a strategy as a matter of urgency. Therefore, will you commit to publishing a specific strategy for tackling Wales's rising waiting times? Will you also confirm that the next Welsh Government budget will provide sufficient resources to health boards across Wales to ensure that these waiting times do not continue to rise? And what assurances can you offer to people across Wales who are waiting for treatment that they will be able to access NHS treatments and services, and that work is actually underway to accelerate the resumption of planned surgeries right across Wales?
Well, Llywydd, the member has asked me 3 questions this afternoon. Each one of them has simply been a rehearsal of the difficulties which are well known and which I am happy to acknowledge. He has not offered not a single suggestion as to how those problems might be addressed. And those problems are common right across the United Kingdom, where his party is in charge. In March of this year, there were 3,000 people waiting more than 52 weeks. By the end of July, it was 83,000 people. If there were easy answers to these very real dilemmas, they would be available here in Wales just as they would be available elsewhere. There are no easy answers, and the members' contributions this afternoon have not offered not a single idea as to how these real difficulties might better be addressed. And when it comes to saying to me, will I guarantee that next year's budget will provide money, let me remind him, we don't know what the Welsh Government's budget next year is going to be. Once again, his government, having promised a budget in the early autumn, have decided that they can't manage to do that. We will not know until the end of November what money we have here in Wales for any of our public services. In that situation, how does he expect, how could he possibly expect guarantees of how our money might be deployed when we don't know how much money we will have for any public purpose? His complaints will be better directed to those who could put that right.
Arweinydd Plaid Brexit, Mark Reckless.
First Minister, could I caution you against describing people as disgraceful just because they, in this case, Conservative members in North Wales, take a different view on coronavirus restrictions to that you have and ask questions about it? Your government has a stated long-term ambition for 30% home working in Wales, even post-pandemic. You say you'd achieve this by driving changes to Wales's working culture. First Minister, your Deputy Transport Minister says we have an opportunity to push home working. Others might call it exploiting the pandemic to push his own prior political agenda. What will the impact of this be on our city centres and the shops and offices there, particularly on independent businesses that can no longer serve commuters? Won't your target for home working be the final nail in the coffin for many of them? And why do you think Welsh Government can plan our society from the centre as if you were all seeing and all knowing? Why is 30% the right number?
Well, Llywydd, I used the term disgraceful knowingly, thoughtfully, and it is a disgrace for this reason, that the letter that was published by Conservative MPs and, as I say, members of this Senedd as well last week, was an encouragement to people in North Wales not to abide by the law that is passed here in Wales. And I do think that for lawmakers that is disgraceful, because it encouraged them to think that the restrictions that we have had to place on people in North Wales were unnecessary and unjustified. None of that was true, and it undermines the willingness of other people who want to make sure they are making their contribution from making that as well. And I think that that was a disgraceful thing to do, and I'm very happy to stand by that description of it. So the coronavirus crisis has been a dreadful experience for so many of our fellow citizens and continues to be so. But from it all, we do need to find ways of thinking of things that we can take out of it and to help us to shape our future in a different way. And the fact that we have all learned to work differently, not to have to travel in large numbers to office locations when people can work just as satisfactorily and successfully from remote locations or even from home is one, I think, of the positive lessons we can take from the last 6 months. The Welsh Government wants to capture that positive experience and make it part of the way that we see Wales here in the future. And it will mean that businesses will have to respond to those change patterns. And it is not a matter of businesses being lost in the aggregate, because those businesses will relocate and be recreated in places, in our towns, closer to where people live. We're using our remote working hubs. People will now be able to go and do those things which you can't do at home while spending part of the working week working from home as well. It will aid work-life balance. It will reinvigorate parts of our towns outside our large cities. It will have a beneficial impact on our environment. It is a legitimate and, I think, well-supported ambition for the way that we want to do things here in Wales.
So for those independent businesses serving commuters, tough. First Minister, when the UK government suggests it might pay for the M4 relief road, a project you promised but then said you couldn't afford, you and your colleagues react as if it's an assault on devolution. But you show little sign yourself of respecting the devolution settlement. You seek to enforce a border with England by preventing people who can travel legally within England from travelling to Wales. You have a Minister for Foreign Relations. You say devolve justice, which your backbenchers tell us could mean pardoning people convicted of attacking the police. You accepted devolution of income tax raising powers without the referendum that was promised. You have even said that your support for the union is not unconditional, which the Plaid Cymru leader describes as indie curious. Now you follow him on border control between England and Wales. Might you next year take another step on that slippery slope to independence by voting for Adam Price to be our First Minister? Or do you rule that out?
Shall I remind the members I've had to many times it was he who voted not to hold a referendum on income tax powers for the Senedd, not me. He was then a Conservative Member of Parliament. It was the Conservative Party who changed his mind about a referendum, and no doubt he went along with it at the time. It's rich of him to try to complain about it now or to suggest that somebody else is responsible. Llywydd, I will not be voting for a candidate of any other party other than the Labour Party to be First Minister here in Wales, and I look forward to convincing as many of our fellow citizens as possible to take the same journey.
Cwestiwn 4, Alun Davies.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. What support has the Welsh Government provided to businesses in Blaenau Gwent during the coronavirus pandemic?
So I thank Alun Davies for that question. To date, a total of 199 micro and SME businesses in Blaenau Gwent have been awarded funding via the Economic Resilience Fund, totalling £3 million. In addition, we have awarded 62 startup grants worth £155,000 and 1,420 COVID-19 non-domestic business rate grant awards, totalling £15.8 million in Blaenau Gwent alone.
I'm grateful to the First Minister for that answer, and I know that many businesses in Blaenau Gwent are also extremely grateful for the support they've received from the Welsh Government throughout the course of this pandemic. But we also know, and I welcome the publication of a statement this morning on how we will rebuild from this pandemic. And we know that areas such as Blaenau Gwent will require continued and increased investment in order to maintain the viability of businesses in the Heads of Valleys region. That investment will need to be holistic and comprehensive, invest in people and places. Will the First Minister confirm that the Welsh Government will continue to invest in the economy of the Heads of Valleys, and Blaenau Gwent in particular, but we'll also continue to invest in areas such as superfast broadband, the rail network, to ensure that we have the holistic industrial strategy that places like Blaenau Gwent will require in order to maintain vitality and jobs into the future.
So I thank Alan Davies for that and entirely agree with him that our investment strategy has to be a combination of investing in people, in providing them with the skills, with the training, with the opportunities that they need to fashion their own futures, and to invest in places as well, so that those places are accessible and those places thrive. And through our Transformation Towns package, for example, which I know has proposals, practical proposals in Blaenau Gwent, in Bryn Mawr, in Tredegar, in Nantaglo. Those are places that people want to live in and recognise as being valued. I was very interested, Llywyd, in what Alan Davies said towards the end of his question about the Welsh Government going on investing in superfast broadband and in our railway network. I read over the weekend an article by the leader of the Welsh Conservatives here, in which he said that were he to be in charge at the Senedd, he would be bringing an end to expenditure by the Welsh Government on non-devolved responsibilities. While I remind him that when it comes to superfast broadband, of the £200 million that has been spent in it by the public service here in Wales, 67 million came from the UK government and over 130 million has come from the Welsh government on a non-devolved responsibility, specifically in order to make up for the market failures and the failure to invest of the Conservative government in Westminster. So I'm very happy to confirm to Alan Davies that this government will invest in those things that make a difference to people in Wales. And where we have to make good the failures of the UK government, we will step in to make sure that people in Wales have the connectivity they need, whether that is by broadband, whether it is by public transport, but otherwise will be so shamefully neglected.
Laura Ann Jones.
Thank you. First Minister, businesses in Blaenau Gwent and other counties suffering from the effects of local lockdowns are able to claim support from you, from this government's Economic Resilience Fund, and that is very welcome. However, local lockdowns are having a serious and damaging effect on businesses in Monmouthshire due to lack of people from surrounding areas who would normally, and obviously now cannot, travel there to shop, work and eat out. One small trader I visited yesterday told me they'd gone from 200 customers a day to under 20. Tourism businesses are already reporting cancellations. Unless these businesses receive support, they are unlikely to survive. So can I support the Monmouthshire County Council's plea to you and ask you, First Minister, to please extend the third phase of your £60 million Economic Resilience Fund to traders in areas like Monmouthshire that are adversely affected from being surrounded by local lockdowns?
So I thank Lauren Jones for that question, which is a proper and serious question, which I know my colleague Ken Skates is thinking about and will have heard the representations from Monmouthshire. When I last spoke with Peter Fox, the Conservative leader of Monmouthshire, he was clear that local lockdown restrictions were not yet required in that county, and I hope we will be able to avoid them altogether. £80 million of the phase 3 of the Economic Resilience Fund, and I thank the member for what she said about it, is of course available to businesses in Monmouthshire as elsewhere. But I will make sure, and I will ask my colleague Ken Skates to read what she has said this afternoon about the border impacts on neighbouring authorities where local lockdown restrictions are required.
Question 5, Hefin David.
Will the First Minister provide an update on the local coronavirus restrictions as they currently apply to Caerphilly County Borough?
I can thank Kevin David for that. So it's encouraging that the incidence of coronavirus has continued its gradual fall in Caerphilly Borough over the last 7 days. This is a reflection of the committed efforts of people who live in the area. Provided that fall continues, we will work with local authorities and others to plan for the gradual lifting of those restrictions.
With over the last few weeks in Caerphilly, here in Caerphilly, we've done our very best to get the community spread of COVID-19 under control. And as the First Minister recognises, we've achieved that. And I welcome the fact that he recognises that. And I also offer him the opportunity again to offer congratulations to the people of Caerphilly in achieving that. Could he provide us with an outline of how the decision process is going to be made this week and every week? How does the decision-making process happen? Is it a meeting with the County Borough Council? Is the Health Minister involved? If you can explain how that takes place this week, and subsequently then, when will the public announcements be made? In what form and how? And perhaps with this last question, I'm pushing my luck, but would he be able to give us an indication of where we may be this week?
Llywydd, can I thank Hefyd David for all those very proper questions. And I just want to say again, he is right that Technical Advisory Cell summary, to which Adam Price referred earlier this afternoon, says in it there is an improving picture in Caerphilly, attributed to the introduction of local restrictions, the swift multi-agency response, and the mobility data for Wales, hard data, demonstrates that there are reductions in mobility in Wales, particularly around Caerphilly, compared to earlier weeks, which shows that people are, as Hefyd David said, very actively playing their part in trying to bring the rise in coronavirus numbers in that borough under control. The decision-making process goes like this, Llywydd, that in the first part of the week, our public health experts and our scientific advisors will be scrutinising the data, both the data on a 7-day rolling incidence number, the positivity rate in tests carried out in Caerphilly, and surveillance data from the other more general data sources we have through the King's College app, through the wastewater surveillance arrangements we have. That is then reported on Thursday of this week to a meeting that will involve the Welsh Government. I will be there, the Health Minister will attend, the leader of the local authority, local public health authorities, the local health board, and the Gwent Police. That meeting will discuss whether or not we have a reliable enough reduction in the figures and incidents in the Caerphilly area to begin the process of lifting local lockdown restrictions. And in the end, it's ministers who have to decide. So the third and final part of that process, having been advised by all those local players, is that ministers will make a decision, and then we will communicate that decision as quickly as we are able, particularly to local members, but obviously to the public at large. My ambition is to be able to begin the process of lifting those restrictions as soon as it is safe to do so. I want to be clear that I don't believe that that will be an ability to lift all restrictions in one go. We will start with some measures and build them up over a period of weeks. Whether we will be in that position on Thursday of this week, I'm afraid I really couldn't speculate at this point, because I have to allow the process, as I've described, of expert advice, local knowledge and final determination to take its path on Thursday of this week. And then we will do that every Thursday while there are any areas in Wales subject to those local restrictions.
Andrew Arty Davis.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, thank you for that answer to the question. You talked about data and the use of data, and obviously Caerphilly was the first county to go into a localised lockdown on a county-wide basis. I've been promoting over the last couple of weeks the use of as much localised data to have hyper-local lockdowns as possible, and the Welsh Government used some of that data to only lock down Llanelli instead of the whole of Carmarthenshire. How do you see going forward the use of that localised data to help inform your decision making so greater use can be used of the hyper-localised lockdowns where the data supports that instead of county or regional wide lockdowns?
Well, so I think that is a very sensible approach, and it's the one that we will adopt as a Welsh Government. If it is possible to concentrate restrictions in the areas where the problem is greatest, that is exactly what we would aim to do. Sometimes the geography of an area makes that more difficult. Sometimes there is simply spread at a community level across a local authority area that precludes us from being able to use those hyper-local methods. But as Andrew Davies has said, we were able to do so in Llanelli. And when I answered Hefin David and said that I hoped we would be able to take the first steps out of local restrictions when it is safe to do so, then one of the ways that that might be possible would be to see whether within a county borough area the problem has become concentrated in one part of a council locality and to redraw the restriction boundaries within an area. And if that is borne out by the data and can be delivered on the ground, then I think that we have absolutely not closed our minds to pursuing lifting of some restrictions in that way.
Nick Ramsey.
Diolch, Llywydd. What discussions has the First Minister had with local authority leaders regarding local lockdowns?
Llywydd, thank the member for that question. In a series of meetings last week, I met with the leaders of 20 of the 22 local authorities in Wales to discuss these and related matters. Further meetings will take place this week.
Thank you, First Minister. You've obviously covered a fair amount of this with previous questions, so feel free to be brief. You mentioned discussions with local authority leaders. In answer to Laura Ann Jones earlier, you reiterated those discussions. I spoke with Councillor Peter Fox this morning, the leader of Monmouthshire County Council, currently an Amber authority, as I'm sure you're aware, regarding the possible use of hyper-local lockdowns within that local authority area. Now, I fully understand that in some cases it might be easier to have wider lockdowns across a full county area. But could you tell us how you're going to ensure that you can look seriously at the hyper-local lockdowns? If, for instance, an area in my constituency, such as Abergavenny, is particularly affected, but other areas in other parts of the county aren't, then it does make a lot of sense to only close down and specifically close down a certain area of the economy, like a market town like that, without affecting other areas of the county area. So I wonder if you could tell us what discussions you've had with Peter Fox and with other council leaders about that.
Well, I've had discussions, as I said, in answer to an earlier question with Councillor Peter Fox, and Nick Ramsey has just given us, I think, a practical example of the point that Andrew Davies made in the last question, and I said then that I thought that was a sensible way of thinking about these things. I'm happy to repeat that in relation to Monmouth. I study the Monmouth figures every day, and Nick Ramsey will be aware that the figures in Monmouthshire have drifted upwards over the last 7 days. But this morning, I also studied the report from the local IMT, which tells me that those cases are well known. They've been identified by the TTP process, that they are being contained in that way, and that there is no present case for introducing local restrictions in any part of Monmouthshire. If that were to change and there were to be a concentration of cases in any particular part of that county, then provided the geographical segregation of that area can be successfully achieved, then we would certainly look at that as a hyper-local response.
Question 7, Delyth Jewell.
What discussions has the Welsh Government held with local authorities and other relevant partners about the suspension of care home visits?
We meet local authorities and other partners, including the Older Persons Commissioner, regularly to discuss a range of issues, including care homes and care home visits.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. First Minister, the Older People's Commissioner for Wales, whom you just mentioned, has raised concerns about the impact that a blanket ban on visiting, in her words, could have on the health and well-being of care home residents. Now, the need to prevent infections in care homes is, of course, of paramount importance. And I do appreciate that it's difficult to balance this against the emotional needs of residents. However, I fear that the trauma of prolonged separation from family members could have a devastating impact on people who rely on seeing members of their family. Visits could be facilitated through a combination of safety measures, including giving visiting families PPE and COVID safety training, allowing distanced outdoor visits where suitable, and confirming positive test results with second tests so that 28-day care home lockdowns are only enforced when it's certain that they're necessary. So, First Minister, will you therefore consider the merits of issuing new guidance along these lines in order to resume some family visits?
Well, Llywydd, the member raises one of the most challenging issues that faces the care home sector for all the reasons that she has set out. The harm that is done to residents when they are unable to see their relations, balanced against that, as Dilynwch said, from the need to prevent the introduction of coronavirus into homes where we know from our experience earlier in the year that once it gets in there, there's a very vulnerable population and the harm can be very considerable. We do constantly update our guidance. The last guidance published on the 28th of August, followed up on the 23rd of September with a letter from Albert Heaney, the head of social services here in the Welsh Government, and Gillian Baranski, the Chief Inspector of Care Inspectorate Wales, and again on the 2nd of October with further detail in a further update from Mr. Heaney. Shall I just briefly read the final paragraph of that letter, because it shows how we are trying to respond to the points that Dilynwch made. So our advice to the sector in the letter says, the Welsh Government is keen to strike a balance between protecting people living in care homes from the very real risks posed by coronavirus and maintaining their well-being and contacts with the family. It is important that we avoid an unnecessarily restrictive blanket approach and that visits to care homes are supported where safe and possible. I will be meeting tomorrow with myself, with Care Forum Wales and a number of other bodies that are responsible for the way in which care homes are run. We will be discussing this matter along with other matters to do with safe running of care homes during the coronavirus crisis, and the sorts of possibilities that Dilynwch mentioned in her supplementary question will, I'm sure, form part of that discussion.
Cwestiwn 8, Rhiannon Pasmo.
Diolch, Llywydd. How does the Welsh Government intend to ensure that Islwyn builds back better from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Llywydd, thank Rhiannon Pasmo for that. The Welsh Government published our recovery plan today. We are committed to a reconstruction that works for all parts of Wales, including Islwyn, by addressing the issues that matter to people most, tackling unemployment, addressing entrenched inequalities, providing affordable housing, the revitalisation of our town centres, and supporting the foundational economy.
Thank you, First Minister. As the member of the Senedd Cymru, I warmly welcome this publication by the Welsh Government of its policy and strategy paper. Within the coronavirus reconstruction challenges and priorities paper, the Minister states that the Welsh Government wants to be open to new ideas and to constructive challenge. So part of this work must be a national conversation. We want to know what matters to you. And to start that conversation, we ask people to get in touch through ourfuture@gov.wales and tell us what they want for our future in Wales. And this is a positive and hopeful dialogue to build back better. So First Minister, will you pledge to the people of Islwyn that the Welsh Government's first priority will be to reduce unemployment and give everyone the opportunity to find and keep work with decent long-term prospects? And how will the Welsh Government take this message to all corners of Islwyn and Wales and give the people of Islwyn the chance of employment that they rightfully demand?
So can I thank Rhiannon Pasmo for that. She is right. The Welsh Government is absolutely open to ideas. In fact, over 2,000 contributions came in to my colleague Jeremy Miles' first invitation to people to give us their thoughts upon how a different sort of Wales could emerge from this coronavirus crisis. And we are absolutely committed to continuing that dialogue and to include in our thinking the many, many ideas that come to us, particularly from people who are working at the front line of our communities, doing the jobs, providing the services, reaching out to other people who are vulnerable in those communities. Llywydd, I want to give the member an absolute assurance that beyond the health service and the coronavirus crisis, jobs are the very top of the agenda here in the Welsh Government, because we are entering a period in which the economic impact of coronavirus is going to be felt in many families and communities across Wales. And as we allow the economy itself to recover, we will act as a Welsh Government, as we have through our Economic Resilience Fund, to make sure that there are opportunities there, particularly for our young people, working alongside the Kickstart programme of the UK Government to create traineeships, apprenticeships, to support employers who are prepared to take on young people as part of their businesses. And that will be as true in Islwyn as it will be in any other part of Wales.
And finally, question 9, Susie Davies.
Diolch yn fawr, Llywydd. Will the First Minister provide an update on COVID-19 advice given to residents in houses of multiple occupation?
Llywydd, we have published coronavirus-related guidance for people living in houses in multiple occupation, including guidance specific to students. It was last published on the 28th of September.
Very much, obviously, that's come in before I table my question, but I think we need some clarification for students in particular, but not exclusively, on the difference between HMOs, which are houses with shared facilities but individual tenancies, and shared houses, flatmates, if you like. Because regardless of the legalities of it, both those groups of people will tend to treat their homes in exactly the same way. I'd be grateful, First Minister, if you could confirm that you will look again at this, despite the fact that we've got fairly new guidance, in order to clarify, particularly in non-lockdown areas, quite how the concept of the extended household and bubble works for the families of the individuals living in those houses, because at the moment, under a shared household arrangement, some of those individuals will be excluded from seeing their families. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie Davies, for that. And of course, I recognise that the guidance was published after her question was submitted. And alongside the guidance, we have published a series of frequently asked questions to deal with some of the complexity that there is in this area. And it is a genuinely complex area where the intersection between the different living arrangements which students who live in Wales tend to occupy, but other people, not simply students who live in houses in multiple occupation or live in flats in the way that Susie Davies has described. I will, of course, ask my officials to study the record of today's proceedings, and if we haven't already been able to provide a clarification with our guidance on the specific question that Susie Davies has raised this afternoon, that we will aim to do so as soon as we are able to get that to happen.
Diolch i'r Prif Weinidog. Yr eitem nesaf felly yw'r datganiad a chyhoeddiad busnes. Rwy'n galw'r trefnydd i wneud y